Hi, this is Dr. Balkan Devlen. I'm the Director for Center in Modern Turkish Studies at Carleton University. And this is the third episode of Talking Turkey, our program in which we talk about Turkey and on Turkey in a frank manner with broad list of experts, scholars, journalists, academics, artists, and others. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Selin Nasi, who is a London-based journalist and a writer. Dr. Nasi is an op-ed contributor to Karar newspaper in Turkey, and also one of the regular contributors to the foreign policy debate program called Femfikir, an all-women, all-female TV show that is broadcasted by Medyascope TV, an independent news outlet in Turkey, which is one of the few left independent news outlets in Turkey. Formerly, she worked as a columnist at Hürriyet Daily News between 2015 and 2018, and in Shalom, the weekly newspaper for Turkey's Jewish community between 2013 and 2018. Dr. Nasi recently received her PhD from Boğaziçi University, and her dissertation was on Turkey's Israeli policy in the post-Cold War, struggle of identity over realpolitik, which I think really nicely encapsulates Turkey's relationship with Israel. And today, that will be our topic. That's the issue that we would like to talk with Dr. Nasi today on Turkey, Turkish-Israeli relations, its future, its past, its present, and where it can go down the road. Selin, it's great to have you.
Likewise, the pleasure is mine, Balkan. Thanks for having me today.
Okay, so let me just start us off with, could you provide us a little bit of a sort of a very broad overview of the development, the historical development of Turkish-Israeli relations, say from the sort of establishment of the State of Israel?
Well, as obvious from the title of my research, I define Turkey's Israel policy and Turkish-Israeli relations as a continuing struggle of identity over realpolitik, in which, to me, the latter has often prevailed, at least until recent times. Turkish-Israeli relations are characterized with ups and downs, but bilateral relations continued through thick and thin, I can say. Turkey, the Palestinian issue has always constituted a sensitive topic for Turkish society. It aroused sympathy from the right and left of the political spectrum, but it didn't prevent Turkey from recognizing Israel as the first Muslim majority country in 1949, for example, or engaging in cooperation with her. What I see is that there are two important points when looking at Turkish-Israeli relations. I see one is that Turkey's relations with Israel have developed as a factor of her relations with the West, especially when you look at the recognition phase after the Second World War. Turkey's recognition of Israel was greatly influenced by her decision to become a member of the Western security structure. And also Turkey's approach to the Arab-Israeli conflict has shown parallels to her political alignments, shifting political alignments. In this respect, you can see the ups and downs throughout the Cold War when Turkey approached to the Arab world because of the Cyprus issue, needed support, and also after the oil crisis of 1973 was in badly need of Arab capital. So these also affected Turkish-Israeli relations. When you move to the more recent times, let's say during the AK Party period.
Before getting into the AK Party period, perhaps maybe a couple tidbits of information for the
golden years.
Yes, for those who are not familiar with the story of Turkish-Israeli relations. As far as I remember, and I might be this is way back when I was looking at it, there was a period of in 1950s, particularly a close security intelligence relationship, right?
Yeah.
We tend to think of Turkish, sort of the golden age of Turkish-Israeli
Mhm.
relations in 1990s, in late 90s perhaps, with the
Mhm.
common sort of threat perceptions in the Middle East.
Mhm.
But it actually stretches back to that period. Maybe just a little bit, a few words on that 1950s relation, and then sort of the golden age one can consider in 1990s before getting into the AKP era.
Okay. Well, first of all, that trident, that strategic partnership, but covert partnership during the Democratic Party rule in Turkey, it's really interesting and an overlooked detail in the history of bilateral relations. Not so many people like to mention about it, especially in the TV debates. They don't like to bring it forth. But it is true. For a brief period during the Democratic Party rule, Turkey, Israel, and Iran, all concerned about the spread of pan-Arabism and communism, established a secret trilateral alliance called Trident, also known as the Periphery Pact. And this triangular pact linked national intelligence organizations of these three countries, namely MIT, Mossad, and Savak. But it ceased its effect after the military coup in Turkey. Actually, it's lasted longer than that. According to Ofra Bengio, it was after 1965 that the military officials declared to the Israeli side that they wanted to end this alliance. And it was partly because of the Cyprus issue that they needed Arab support of the Muslim world before the UN vote on Cyprus. So it was very much connected to the international developments. But as I previously mentioned, Turkey's approach to the Arab-Israeli conflict and its relations with Israel shifted a lot of times in the history of bilateral relations. And I can say that this didn't prevent Turkey from establishing relations, but Turkish policymakers have always had difficulty in striking a balance, maintaining balance between their relations with the Arab world and Israel, and preferred to downplay relations with Israel, keep the relations at a low profile in order not to antagonize the Arab world. So that is the case. Moving to the 1990s, I also discussed this in detail in my research. Cue shameless self-promotion here. Sorry about that. But the period of 1990s, the strategic partnership, stands as an aberration in the history of bilateral relations because there were some overlapping factors which rendered this period unique. To begin with, there was this Oslo peace process, which in fact this peace process started with the Madrid Conference of 1991, which provided Turkey a legitimate context to upgrade relations with Israel. On the other hand, Turkey and Israel were on the same page when it came to the strategic threat perceptions in the region. So Turkey had faced a struggle in fighting an insurgency at home. Its relations with Syria and Iran deteriorated sharply during this decade. And also Turkey was not happy with the support she provided to the United States in the Gulf War. I mean, the impact of the Gulf War didn't turn out to be the way that Turkish policymakers expected. The outcome was different than they expected. So they had to live with Saddam Hussein, which Turkey supported that the US operation against Iraq, but then had to live with Saddam Hussein for the rest of the decade. So it wasn't an easy situation for the Turkish policymakers back then. And apart from this, Turkey also had difficulty with obtaining arms procurement from countries, especially from Germany and the United States, because of human rights concerns. Fighting insurgency at home, because of these issues, the US Congress imposed a covert embargo on Turkey. And at a time when Turkey had difficulty obtaining these weapons, Israel came to the help of Turkey and became a strong defense partner, providing the weapons that Turkey really badly needed at the time.
Even
so they had overlapping interests.
Exactly, and I think I think that context, the sort of the military and armament procurement, and particularly I would say the technology transfers component, I think is an extremely important and unfortunately overlooked aspect of the benefit that Turkey had with its relations with Israel, while say the U.S. Congress is actually actively impeding technology transfers. Turkey managed to get do the technology transfers on weapon systems and so on and so forth via Israel, and I think that was a very important component in 1990s. But when we come to the AKP era, let's say in the early 2000s, where were the relations and how they evolved throughout that time?
I wanted to make another point before moving to the AK Party era, and that is the strategic partnership of the 1990s also had a domestic politics dimension, Balkan, because the army considered Turkey's relations with Israel as an antidote to the rise of political Islam in the country. So Turkey's cordial ties with Israel became a benchmark of the country's pro-Western and secular identity. That was also an important aspect of Turkey's relations with Israel, which we don't see in the coming years, which is a difference. Why, for example, when the Welfare Party and Islamist Party, known for its anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic stance, became the major coalition partner in 1996, for example, couldn't pursue the policies that its leader promised his constituency, for example, because the army pressured on Necmettin Erbakan back then to sign the defense agreements with Israel, for example. But that wasn't the case during the AK Party era, and I'm coming to that. When the AK Party came to power in 2002, understandably, this was met with concern in Israel that it would cause a shift in Turkey's Western orientation and that Turkish-Israeli relations would deteriorate. However, this didn't happen, at least in the short run. The new government, in the wake of the elections, declared that it was willing to maintain cordial relations with the West and Israel, and it also was in favor of, it distanced itself from its Islamist roots. As an indicator of its Western orientation, the government also fully embraced the EU membership agenda. At the time, this policy suited the AK Party because it was an inexperienced party in the first place, and it avoided confrontation with the pro-Western secular military. Therefore, I can say that from 2002 until the Mavi Marmara incident in 2010, Turkish-Israeli relations have followed within the confines of bilateral cooperation of the 1990s. However, from a closer look, the regional security setting, and especially the strategic incentives which made such a partnership possible between Turkey and Israel, had already changed even before the AK Party came to power. To name a few of these developments, first of all, the outbreak of the Second Intifada actively put an end to the Oslo peace process. And then, apart from this, Turkey's normalization of relations with its neighbors decreased Israel's significance as a defense partner. But still, the institutional framework of the economic and security partnership remained by and large intact, at least until the end of 2008, I must say. Retrospectively, the collapse of Turkey-mediated Israel-Syria talks in late 2008, owing to Israel's launching of the Operation Cast Lead in Gaza, has laid in Gaza dealt a heavy blow to Turkish-Israeli relations, because then Prime Minister Erdogan invested a lot personally and politically in this peace initiative and perceived Israel's decision to attack Gaza without informing Turkey or even given a hint, perceived it as a betrayal, and he took it personally. And this eroded trust between the two countries. Then in January 2009 came Erdogan's famous one-minute media bashing moment at the Davos summit. The Davos summit as well was another turning point in the history of bilateral relations, because the government, especially Erdogan himself, realized domestic and foreign gains to be earned from embracing a defiant tone against Israel. But this is not to say that the shift in Turkey's Israel policy was purely on the government. I mean, we cannot blame solely the government. In terms of putting things into context, we should also take into account the international and regional developments, as well as structural changes taking place in Turkish politics. For one thing, Turkey benefited immensely from the post-9/11 and post-Iraq war international context. Under the AK Party, Turkey received praise as a model country for its Muslim identity, as well as its commitment to secularism and having a pro-Western strategic orientation, this and that. Turkey also benefited from the power vacuum in the post-Iraq war period. Having the US military at their doorstep forced Syria and Iran to maintain friendly relations with Turkey. We can add to that desecuritization of foreign policy, which I already touched upon a bit. This is a process indeed started with the Adana Protocol of 1998. For those who are not familiar with it, it is an agreement which put an end to hostility between Turkey and Syria and led to the extradition of PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan, and then he was captured and delivered to Turkey. But therefore, that Adana Protocol paved the way for normalization of ties between Syria and Turkey, and then, of course, it led to a greater normalization between Turkey and her neighbors in the region. But this regional setting encouraged AK Party's political and economic engagement in the greater Middle East area. So looking back, the AK Party's multidimensional foreign policy, in a way, not only boosted the government's international credibility, but also helped consolidate its power at home. And this is also important because when looking at Turkish-Israeli relations in 2000s, one has to mention domestic political developments during this period. First off, the AK Party, as the AK Party was implementing EU reforms, the Turkish armed forces, which constituted the backbone of Turkish-Israeli relations, were ultimately excluded from politics, which is, from a democratic point of view, is a good thing, of course. But for Turkish-Israeli relations, it had other consequences. Secondly, the AK Party's consolidation of power at home paved the way for concentration of power in the hands of the executive, namely Erdogan and his advisors. As such, Turkish foreign policy has become susceptible to ideological preferences and domestic political considerations of the new political elites. Only when we take these structural changes at the domestic level into consideration, the impact of international developments become more meaningful. So in retrospect, Turkey's rising international image encouraged Ankara to pursue a more independent, quote-unquote, foreign policy line prior to the Mavi Marmara incident. For instance, think about nuclear swap deal Turkey mediated, brokered together with Brazil, for example. In those days, Turkey saw Israel less as a partner, but more as a competing power. And in this regard, Turkey was trying to present herself as an alternative, as a useful ally to Washington, and even aiming to replace Israel, regardless of the fact that this was a very, very, very unrealistic expectation, given the special relationship between Israel and the United States, of course. But anyway, Of
No,
course,
I
in this.
think I mean this is an excellent overview how the dynamics change and how they actually interplay. I mean this is a very important part because just if just to summarize maybe is the fact that the changing regional dynamics,
Mhm.
changing threat perceptions, together
Great.
with the
Yeah.
changing domestic structure
Mhm.
and sort of Erdogan's growing into power and being more confident, enabled or open up space by reducing both domestic constraints
Mhm.
for him to pursue his particular ideological foreign policy, but also the changes in international system uh, overlapped with a particular, so is less constraining perhaps,
Mhm.
and thus less punishing when missteps are taken, at least in the short term, and that enabled a shift, a changes, and I would assume,
Precisely.
and
Precisely.
I don't know much about sort of the development within the Israeli domestic politics, but I could assume that there are similar, but not necessarily exactly the same structure, but there are changes within the Israeli domestic politics with Netanyahu sort of
The rise
solidifying
of
his,
political right, maybe the
yeah.
demographics also support the rise of political right in Israel. So
So
on the
that
Israeli
seems to
side,
be
things are not going great either. I mean,
so exactly. So I think that that seems to be, which I want to tie it with to my next question. There seems to be both an overlap of both
mm,
domestic international structural changes, but also
mm,
particularly after the Marmara, and even before with the
mm,
Operation Cast Lead, there are a clash of personalities that also lay over that structural
mm.
changes that radically altered the way that Israel and Turkey structure. Which I want to tie it to the question, the next: where are we now, and where can we go from here?
Well, in order to answer that, perhaps I need to also touch upon the impact of the Arab Spring, because right after this, Turkey's shift to a more independent foreign policy line came the Arab Spring and gave the perfect opportunity for Turkish policymakers to fully implement Ahmet Davutoğlu's strategic doctrine. And you know how the story unfolds after that. Of course, Turkey aspiring to become a regional leader and a global power, channeled her resources together with Qatar, of course, into establishing a power axis in the region, alternative to Saudi Arabia's Wahhabi ideology and Iran's Shia crescent. And in this respect, leading the Ummah or embracing the Palestinian issue as if it was a domestic matter, and ramping up the anti-Israeli rhetoric, these all have been manifestations of the same policy line. So coming fast forward today, where are we now? Well, if you're asking me this question based on the recent statements, I can say that okay, bilateral relations are moving on a positive trajectory. At least seem to be moving. President Erdogan recently stated that he was hoping to see Turkish-Israeli relations in a better place. And from Israel also positive signals are coming. Energy Minister said that he would be very pleased to see Turkey in the East Med Gas Forum, which is fine. But are these enough? What I can see, my reading of the negotiations is that both sides are they are testing waters and trying to understand whether, especially Turkey is sincere in taking these steps or sincere in a reset with Israel. And in this regard, Turkey made clear that the Palestinian issue will remain as her red line. Whereas Israel is trying to get reassurances from Turkey with regard to her own national security concerns. And I'm referring to Turkey's relations with the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas in particular, because this has been a serious bone of contention between the two countries. Israel has been accusing Turkey of turning a blind eye to Hamas activities on Turkish territory, especially the offices were being used, as Israel claims, for planning attack against Israel. And what Israel expects from Turkey is to cut off support, at least limit that support, and perhaps extradite leaders of the military wing in order to facilitate closer ties with Israel.
And one would expect, Turkey, for example, being very upset and very sort of stringent with regards to Syria in 1990s with their support for PKK and hosting their leadership. And one would would have thought that Turkish leadership would be, understanding or empathic to Israeli calls for expulsing and extraditing Hamas leadership, who carry out attacks against Israeli civilians and is a terrorist organization, and perceived as such by large. So Turkey is a country that complains that its allies are not treating PKK like the terrorists they are, is actually in a way mirroring the same structure by housing Hamas. And that's, of course, a surprising, well, not very surprising naturally, but that is a problematic issue, which I want to sort of tie up though. So would that be so if you like, those are the red lines, say, for Israel and for Turkey. I'm going to come back and sort of let you finish up that particular thought. But what are the openings for Turkey and Israel to sort of move around, or is there a chance for compartmentalization of certain issues and move around and cooperate in other areas?
Well, Turkish-Israeli relations have been pursued in a pragmatic manner and have been indeed compartmentalized since the Mavi Marmara. The economic and trade relations between the two countries are insulated from political crisis. So the volume of trade continued to amaze many. On the other hand, we know from Amber'in Zaman's reporting that these two countries have intelligence sharing. And also they have overlapping interests when it comes to balancing and perhaps rolling back Iran's power in the region. And they, without coordination, they support the same sides, whether in Syria or in Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan, for example. So it's also interesting. So that we have an unfulfilled cooperation between the two countries. If you also take into account the energy file as well, energy dossier as well, even though the energy prices plummeted recently, and we don't know when they're going to go up and make the pipeline projects feasible and profitable again. We don't know, but still, we know that these two countries, at the end of the day, will be better off if they cooperate instead of they outflank each other. That's something solid here, what I see.
Two last questions, maybe. One, given the personal, or at least seeming personal animosity between Erdogan and Netanyahu, is there a possibility for proper renormalization as long as these two guys are in power? That's number one. And number two, were you to sit down and offer one piece of advice for Erdogan, President Erdogan, and one piece of advice for Prime Minister Netanyahu, what would be each? What would be your suggestions for each leader? Just if you have chance to give one suggestion.
Well, these are really strong leaders, and they want to say the last word. So they are the decision makers. They make the decisions. Even though you can advise them, I don't think I will be very successful in trying to devise their policies. But yes, we have a bad blood between these two leaders. Erdogan took it personally, as I said, when Israel decided to launched the operation in Gaza back in 2008. And also Netanyahu probably still remembers that Turkey refused to normalize relations after he apologized to Erdogan. through a mediated phone call in which President Obama invested politically a lot, and he was also frustrated afterwards. So this time Israel is trying to get concrete reassurances. This needs concrete steps beyond declarations of intent. Conciliatory remarks won't be enough for Israel to mend fences with Turkey. I don't think so. But from Turkey's side, I can understand the motivation, the incentives of restoring relations with Israel, because what I see is apparently Turkey's identity-based foreign policy has reached its limits. Having fixated on Syrian civil war for so many years, Ankara overlooked the emerging energy cooperation in the Eastern Mediterranean, which evolved into a strategic cooperation, which ultimately excluded Turkey. And also, if you look at this, Turkey's pro-Muslim Brotherhood policy resulted in her regional marginalization. I believe the Saudi-backed country's decision to uplift embargo blockade over Qatar will surely put some pressure on Turkey's ties with the Muslim Brotherhood. So we can see an opening perhaps on this issue. In addition to this, I can say since 2019, Turkey has been pursuing a foreign policy that relies more on hard power than diplomacy, as if to compensate diplomatic losses with an increasingly assertive profile. However, this policy also has its limitations. Turkey, which boasts NATO's second largest army, has shown that its military involvement can change balances in the field, tip balances in the field, as in Syria, Libya, or Azerbaijan. However, fighting on several fronts, given the fragile state of economy at home, is not sustainable for the long term, for the long run. So Turkish economy is struggling with currency crisis, huge external debt, and is badly in need of foreign investment. So which altogether drive Turkey to dial down the tensions with the West. We also have the Biden effect, you can add that. So still we see a trend coming back. Turkey is in search of a diplomatic opening, which involves, mending relations, restoring relations with the West, and restoring relations with Israel is related to this, not independent from it. So it all comes down to Ankara's decision to whether take a step towards a strategic reorientation, perhaps, and in such a way that would perhaps, downplay ideological preferences and bring forward geopolitical interests again. So really an interesting period that we are following closely what's going to...
Exactly. And I think one important sort of variable in that is whether Erdogan government will be able to find, and the allies, the Western allies, as well as Israel, will give him a face-saving option. I think that will be a fundamental to see whether that shift is going to happen. I think I completely agree with this particular search for trying to sort of reset the relations and reestablish some of those connections. But it also, to me, looks like that the Turkish government is trying to do that without necessarily losing domestic face.
Sure.
So that sort of face-saving aspect is in trying to sort of convince the allies to give that level of public
with minimum compromise.
Exactly, right. So I think that's a fascinating thing to see whether that's going to develop or not. I am not particularly optimistic as things stand. I think Erdogan burned a lot of bridges, but we'll see how that.
But it will take time. It will take time. I mean, a genuine normalization requires restoration of mutual trust. I have said it a couple of times, but it is important that we need a stable and durable process in which the two countries will be able to really trust each other again. And only after that, Turkey can expect Israel to lobby on behalf of her, or engage in cooperation, especially in the field of military or defense, I would say, apart from intelligence sharing.
Excellent. Well, Selin, thank you very much. This has been a great chat. And we do cover a lot of and a very deep set of issues. So thank you very much once again coming to the show and talking with us.
Thank you. I enjoyed a lot. Thank you.